This continues the discussion on section 2.3. We are discussing opposites. We already talked about the opposite being a number that is on the opposite side of 0, same distance. Well, what we need to talk about now is notation, and I would also like you to know about the additive inverse. An additive inverse is exactly the same thing as an opposite. It's just defined in a way that gives us a little indication of an identity element. So an additive inverse is a number that is added to the number at hand so that it gives us the identity element of addition, which is 0. And opposites and additive inverses are exactly the same. So an opposite, in terms of notation, we're going to represent that with this negative sign. So let A be any real number that's not 0, and we say the opposite of A is how we read this negative A. And if we wanted to as well, we could put parentheses around the A and read it as the opposite of A. Now this next one says the opposite of A, or just the opposite of negative A. Now the double negative, we know in English we don't like to read double negatives, right? You can't not do something. And so here we have the idea that we don't want the double negative stated like we can here is with just a single negative, and so we simplify that being down to a positive. And we know if we're on an opposite side anyway, that's a negative A, right? Then the opposite of that is the positive A, and that's what we're looking at here. So we're going to look at the opposite of each of the numbers below. So if I want to write the opposite of 3 here, so I say, okay, the opposite of 3. So the opposite of 3 is going to give me a negative 3. So this opposite of 3 is a negative 3. And you notice I used the double-headed arrow again, not the equal sign, because they aren't equal. This is giving us this value. And the opposite of a negative 16, that's going to be a positive 16, or just 16, because we often don't say the positive, right? And then the last one, we have 205 twelfths, which is one of our real numbers. It's a fraction, right? Real number. And if I want the opposite of 205 twelfths, the opposite of 205 twelfths is a negative 205 twelfths. Now it's worth noting here that I can put this negative sign in either the numerator, or I could put it down here in the denominator, or equally as good, I can just put it out in front of the entire fraction, and it doesn't matter in any of those which it is. It's still read as the opposite, so we don't have to worry about where that gets attached. Now typically I'll either write it out here in front like this one, or I'll write it out in the front of the numerator, but these are all equivalent statements. All right, now I want us to go ahead and practice with the opposites. So we're going to practice on this next example here with using the notation to make this same indication. So I'm going to call this example 2 here. And so on this one, we have the opposite of a negative 5. That's how I would read that. And an opposite of a negative 5, now that it's actually written in notation, I actually can write an equal sign. And so the opposite of a negative 5 is a positive 5. Or if you like a negative and a negative, make a positive. Some people already know about that, but that's not something we've introduced yet. All right, the next one says the opposite of a 6. And in that case, we know the opposite of a 6 is a negative 6. So we write that a negative 6. And then our last example here, we have the opposite of a negative 91 100ths. So the opposite of a negative 91 100ths, well, the opposite of a negative we know is a positive. And so that's what we're going to write. The opposite of this thing is equal to a positive number. And this is going to be a positive 91 100ths. And that's what